So, good afternoon, everyone. I think we can get started. It's a pleasure to start this 13th webinar of the series Zooming in on Migration and Asylum. And today we're going to present some of the findings from the AdmiGov project on the governance of exit regimes and sustainable reintegration post-exit. My name is Barak Kalir. I will chair the session and I will also be one of the presenters. And let me just say that it's great to have so many of you already with us. Maybe some will also join soon. Let me say that you can put your questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A function of the Zoom screen. You can do that throughout our presentations. We will open the floor after the presentation and the discussant commentary, and we are very much looking forward to a lively discussion. So whenever we present and you find that you have a question about, just please drop it in the Q&A. So without further ado, let me start by giving you a small overview of how the session will go about. We'll start with a short presentation of the speakers and the discussant. I will give a small overview of the location of the governance of exit in the AdmiGov projects. And then I will move to share with you some major insight from our exercise in trying to map governance regimes across the EU member states. Talita will my colleague will then give some key findings regarding sustainable reintegration post-exit with case studies from Albania, Senegal, and Iraq. We'll be mostly also focusing on policy recommendations, but we might raise other important issues that emerge during our research. We will then have commentary from our discussant, which is Zeynep Sahin Manchutek. And we will then open the floor for further discussion with all of you. So let me first maybe do the small round of presentations. Myself, like I said, I'm Barak Kalir. I'm an anthropologist based in the University of Amsterdam, where I teach. And I do research in recent years, mostly on the way that migrants are indeed being removed from one place, whether it's to a third country or what is called back home. I have rounded off an ERC project a year ago that really looked into how different states around the world are doing that kind of process of returning migrants. And I'm very happy that I could take part in this AdmiGov project with more or less the same kind of topic. So I will give now the floor to Talita to present herself, and then to Zeynep, please.
Thanks, Barak. I'm Talitha Dubo. I work at UNU Merit and Maastricht University as a researcher there. My work focuses on migration decision-making, trajectories, and also reintegration. And I'm also currently completing my PhD thesis on migration decision-making in the Western Balkans.
Hello everyone, and hello Barak, and thank you for having me. I'm Zeynep Sahin Manchutek. I'm a senior researcher at Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies. I have been working on the migration governance for a time. Since the last year, I was a part of another Horizon project called Respond. And now here in Bonn, I'm leading in a project on the reintegration trajectories of the returnees, and looking at more or less the similar countries you are looking in Western Balkans, in Western Africa, and also in the Middle East. I'm very happy to be part of the discussion today, and I'm very excited already to reading your reports before you are asking me to be discussant, and I'm very happy to be a conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're also really extremely happy that you were willing to be the discussant today, Zeynep, and we're looking forward to that. So let me now run you a bit by where we are when we are looking into the governance of exit within the AdmiGov project. So I won't dwell on it too much, but just that you get an overview of the project. So we had different work packages on entry, on circular migration, and on exit. So basically, we try to adopt an holistic view of how mobility is being managed in the EU and in different member states. We had two parallel teams that are very important in all these phases, and these are the protection and human rights of migrants and the notion of development. And basically the idea of the project was, one of the major goal was to generate indicators for measuring good governance of mobility in Europe. So in my presentation, I will also point to a couple of the indicators that we have tried to suggest and recommend. And we will not do justice to all the work that has been done in the project, of course, not even in this work package. So I warmly advise you to, if you're interested, to visit our website where you can download all the reports. I think most of the reports are actually completed. So if you're interested, please go there and download whatever report that is of your interest. As I said, even we are adopting a holistic approach, and we're doing that also within every work package. So in this work package, we did in two deliverables this attempt, which I will share with you in my presentation. And that is that we try to map different exit regimes, different exit models across the EU. We did 4 case studies in which we looked a bit more in depth into how exit is being regulated and implemented. We did that in Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. My colleague Arja Omkens, that couldn't be here with us today, was very instrumental in doing these two deliverables. We also looked into the work of Frontex and civil society and the private sector, the markets of border controls. My colleague Martin Lemberg-Pedersen was in charge of that one, and he also could not be here today, unfortunately. So we won't bring a lot of the input that came from this deliverable, but again, I point you to our website if you're interested, and you can download that report there. We are very happy that Talita is with us, and she will present the work that she did together with Katie Kushminder on sustainable reintegration post-exit. And finally, we also looked into alternative to pre-removal detention and different ways to legalize the status of irregular migrants. That work was done by our colleague in the law department in Barcelona, Marcus Gonzalez Bilifus, who also could not be with us today, unfortunately. I will mention some of the inputs from there, but again, our website is the best place to get a full idea of the work in this work package. So let me start with exit regimes and the governance of exit. I should first say that with exit, it's this kind of a word that we came up with, trying to give a roof to all the things that have to do with what is otherwise called sometimes expulsions, otherwise return, voluntary or forced, removals, deportations. Exit should sort of capture all these means that are there to make sure that people that do not have the right status for staying in a member state or in the EU in general should leave that territory. And with exit regimes, we try to bring together two aspects, the legal and the operational infrastructures. With the legal infrastructures, we mean all the kinds of laws and regulations, directives, readmission agreements that determine first how certain migrants are becoming illegalized or they lose their status. And it also outlines the procedure that then should apply in order for them to leave the country, a member state country, or the European Union as a whole. And the operational infrastructure is basically the work and the investment in all kinds of state agencies, but also in civil society organization, and to a larger extent, an increasing extent in private companies that are charged with enforcing the legal infrastructures. So here we're talking about things like budget, personnel, and technology. And we looked into all of that. I should also say very quickly that when we talk about exit, of course, we also talk about how the exit of people with status, the orderly exit of, let's say, tourists or business people is regulated and enforced. But we, of course, didn't look so much into that, but rather into the exit of the so-called more problematic population of irregular migrants who would like to stay in the territory of a member state or the European Union and are not entitled to it. So our main goals were to answer these two following questions from the perspective of the EU or the member state. The question that we posed ourselves was how close or far are the EU and member states from implementing an efficient and effective exit governance regime? And we did that according to their own stated goals. So we have all, I think, bracketed here our own personal views of what does it mean to have an efficient and effective exit governance model. But we looked into how successful it is according to the stated goals of these member states and the European Union. And from the migrants' perspective, we looked into the extent that these existing policies and practices ensure safe returns and sustainable reintegration. And a second goal that we had was, as I mentioned already before, to generate indicators for what would and how could a good governance of exit look like. And here we should all be aware that currently there are no such clear stated indicators for evaluating either past or current or proposed policies that concern the exit of irregular migrants. So first, something about the methodology. Our research was unfortunately taking place mostly during COVID-19, which we are all aware that we're still very much in it. That meant that although we planned some ethnographic fieldwork, we were not really able to conduct it. Most of our research was done either by doing interviews over Skype or Zoom and this kind of means, or by subcontracting researchers, like was the case that I think Talita will talk more about in Senegal and in Iraq. There were some countries that when we were supposed to do the research were really badly hit by the pandemic, and like Spain, and research was hardly at all possible there. The other thing that I want to mention is actually even more important to the methodology of this research is that what we found out when we started doing the research is that getting access to relevant information on exit from member states and the European agencies has been often really difficult and sometimes even impossible. And this was something that was quite striking for us, I have to say, because our assumption was that material about and information about exit is non-confidential in essence. I mean, we were never after names and individuals, we were only after aggregated information. And since exit is, we haven't seen anything that could lead to the matter being confidential in essence. So we were quite surprised about the way that some agencies and some member states were really fencing off our access from this information. And that had also like three important consequences. The first one is that we have to acknowledge that our accounts are of course incomplete because our information was not completed. But it's also that we realize that if we cannot get all this information and gather it with a good and clear methodology as we set out to do, that means that it's also the case for a lot of member states themselves and the European Union on a whole, which is quite detrimental to this notion of furthering evidence-based policymaking and scientific investigation. Now, this, I think, in our case is even more telling because our project is funded by the European Union, right? It's Horizon 2020. And even researchers with doing the research under this ticket of being funded by the European Union, we were meeting a lot of closed doors that some information was just not shared with us, even though we presented, of course, the fact that our goal is to help and assist the European Union in bettering its policymaking. And something that is probably not surprising, and I will touch on it a bit more maybe later, is that one reason that we think that there is this data ambiguity or inaccessibility is, of course, that it then lends itself when actually the factual ground is not being able to be established. It lends itself to manipulation and to populist and political ends. So this leads me to the first indicator that we thought that is very much necessary, and that has to do with the quality of data for the governance of exit. At the moment, the EU, the European Commission, has no guidelines for member states about how to produce, maintain, share, collect data on exit. So it might be striking, but for example, there is no obligation to, or a shared methodology to collect data on the number of irregular migrants in each member state. There is, again, not such obligation to record pre-removal detention or the span of it. There is no obligation to record the number of forced and voluntary exit, which then means that some member states are doing it, some are doing it less, some are doing it better. Some are doing it with very different methodologies. So when you get the data, it's very difficult to actually compare it. And different things are being recorded by different member states. So we recommend to put together a comprehensive and binding guidelines for the collection of data and the production of statistics so that we can have, we can really live up to that ideal of having evidence-based policymaking with respect to exit. And we also think that we should actually insist that this kind of indicator is first established, is first constructed, before there is a move with any new legislation or the recast of the return directive. I think we first recommending really strongly that there is this kind of indicator that will allow us to then measure and to monitor how are these new regulations actually living up to expectations so that we can actually assess their performance. Otherwise, we feel that this is a very lacking endeavor. Then we also found out that there is a lack of uniformity in the followings in terms of between member states. There is a lack of uniformity when it comes to what are the goals of exit regimes, like how many irregular migrants should be returned, over what period. Are we looking into a 1 year? Are we looking into a 5-year plan, etc.? There is not this kind of uniformity across member states about what are the very basic goals of the exit regime. Then there is also not uniformity about the means. So like what is the efficient or effective length of pre-removal detentions, or how effective and possible are alternatives to detentions? What kind of budgets should be allocated to voluntary return vis-a-vis forced removal? All these kind of things are also just done very differently by different member states at the moment. When it comes to procedures, there is also no harmonization. There is not like one way in which you notify migrants about their deportation order or their removal order. And in some countries, irregular migrants actually end up not even knowing that they have a removal order on their names. So we really thought that this is quite telling. There is also like very different units that are responsible for exit in different member states. In some countries, it's the police that is in charge of it. In other countries, it's a civil servant, a unit in the ministry. And in other countries is a mixture of the two, and the engagement of private companies, for example, for running detention centers. So the exit regime looks very differently in different member states. And finally, there is also not uniformity about what are the actually expected results of exit regimes. Are we looking to have a lower absolute number of irregular migrants or a proportion of the existing total population? Do we focus mostly on failed asylum seekers, or do we look, I mean, the target group is failed asylum seekers, or is it all visa overstayers? All these things are looking very differently in different member states. We also discovered that there are no mechanisms to learn across the EU from member states' good practices. There is very little or no sharing of knowledge, experiences, data, and resources. There is little operational collaboration between member states, although of course irregular migrants are very often moving between them, but there is not a sharing of information and collaboration around the implementation of exit in case that migrants are moving between member states. And there are no, as we all I think know, there are no blanket agreements with most destination countries, but instead every member state is now negotiating bilateral agreements with certain countries and not with others. This has two important consequences. One is that most of the heavy lifting is done by Frontex when it comes to coordination, and this has very high cost, also because the task from Frontex is very often to show as if there is a EU collaboration on exit. And what you get is that although, let's say there is an operation in Greece, in the maritime border with Turkey, and Frontex can use Greek vessels for it, it might just ship vessels all the way from the Netherlands or Germany just in order to forge this kind of an EU collaboration, which is extremely costly, as we can all imagine. And yeah, it might also indicate that member states make a huge political issue out of exit, but in practice, we found out that there is this very interesting discrepancy between the lack of sharing of knowledges and practices about an issue that apparently is very high on the political agenda. Another important issue that came up, and I know that this is a bit eclectic how I'm presenting it, but I'm just trying to sort of put the most important things up front, and we can discuss them later more. So there is a discrepancy that we also found between bottom-up and top-down kind of policy making when it comes to exit regimes. There is a disconnect between policy making and practitioners' experience. And I think the prime example that we found is in pre-removal detentions, where from available quantitative data and across the years, we ran this kind of correlations across the years, we could not establish that there are any correlations, let alone causal links between increasing the length of pre-removal detentions and the rates of returns, right? So there doesn't seem to be that if you extend the pre-removal detention, more people will be returned eventually. And from qualitative data that we collected in interviews with practitioners in some of detention centers across Europe, we pretty much heard from most of them that they think that the optimal length of detention for removal is between 2 to 3 months. After that, it actually, for many of them, seems to be ineffective to detain migrants for a longer period because they become depressed and ideal, and to then proactively make them leave the country becomes an even more difficult task. And nevertheless, and in spite of this kind of evidence-based projections and information, the EU has persistently pushed to expand the minimum length of the first detention. It recently extended the maximum length of repetitive detention, and it lowered the threshold for justifying the detention of irregular migrants, now also on the grounds of public order. So a very interesting discrepancy between the experiences of practitioners within the exit regime and policymaking about it. So finally, the final exercise that we try to make is to evaluate the success of existing regimes. And like I said in the beginning, evaluating the success according to the stated goals of these regimes, not according to our views of what is a successful exit regimes. So we have these 5 criteria that we established that we think most exit regimes obey by. The first one is to have basically the highest possible number of voluntary returns, and then or forced removals if that's becoming necessary. To have the lowest numbers of re-entering returnees, so an effective reintegration, sustainable reintegration post-exit policy. To strive to cost-benefit effectiveness, so not to spend more money and budgets and personnel than is basically necessary. To ensure the peacefulness of return procedures, so looking at it from migrants' protection view and in line with the Sustainable Development and the New York Declaration, to safeguard at least the basic rights of and safety and order and dignified way of having people leaving the country. And the fifth criteria, which is not one that is declared by most countries, I have to say, it is, for example, very much on the table in the UK with its deliberate policy of the hostile environment. In other countries, it's not so much voiced, but nevertheless, it's very present. And that is the idea that exit regimes should also deter any potential irregular migrants from coming to this country and also encourage those that are in it to leave independently or voluntarily. And the guiding assumption behind this is that if there is an increased investment in exit regimes along all these 5 criteria, the regime is going to work more effectively and efficiently. And this is our call for another indicators, because we have not found that these criteria are actually being matched with what happens in exit regimes in realities. So investment has consistently ran up, and that was never, we could not find, as I was saying before, we could not find a correlation with, for example, increase in detention and the rate of return. We could also not find a correlation between this increased investment in exit regimes and, again, rates of return. So it doesn't seem like if just pouring more money on these existing exit regimes will just lead somehow to more returns. And while we recognize that the number of irregular migrants can never be accurately estimated, but in broad brushstrokes, what we found is that the proportion of irregular migrants leaving EU member states is also not increasing. So very interesting findings there, we think. And despite of rhetoric, measures that are taken by the EU and member states in recent years have actually put under more pressure the well-being and fundamental rights of irregular migrants. So this kind of rhetorical claims of safeguarding the well-being of returnees and doing it in a dignified way, there is very little evidence that this is matched up with practices within exit regimes. Then there is quite a wide evidence from different countries that this idea of stricter detention and forced removal measures in deterring potential irregular migrants is actually having any effect. Not in deterring those who are planning to come to European countries, and either to really push those who are here to live independently. And finally, and I think that is something that Talita will talk about much more next, is that reintegration post-exit is also often not sustainable, and it leads a lot of migrants to re-enter the European Union after they have been removed or returned. So our recommendation here is that there should be this kind of indicator for assessing how investment in exit regimes is actually matched up with results and efficiency and effectiveness on the ground. And again, this also links up to the first indicator, because we need to then also collect and gather with very clear methodologies statistics about the functioning of these exit regimes. Some other points, I'm bringing it to a close. We looked into alternatives to pre-removal detention because we found that a very important point. And what we discovered is that in most EU member states, there is not really an active exploration of alternatives to pre-removal detentions. And there is very little implementation of it. There is also, again, not this kind of sharing of information across member states about what works and what doesn't work in this implementation of alternatives. Same with pathways to regularization of status. They are extremely limited in most member states. They are also hidden. It's very difficult, we discovered, for irregular migrants to actually understand and know that they exist in the first place, and then to understand how to move about them in order to regularize their status. So a lot can be done also in that direction, we think. Finally, with Frontex, as I said, we have done a lot of work about it. It's a pity that our colleague is not with us today to talk about it more. And you can read this very hefty report that we have about it in our website. I would just want to mention here that we highlight there also the need for another indicator that has to do with the privatization of the exit regimes. So we do think that with this huge increase in the investment in Frontex and the major role that it now plays in exit regimes, there needs to be an indicator that monitors and assess expenditures that is done by Frontex and flows into private companies that we discovered that are significantly shaping the field of exit with technological, what they call improvements, and basically also with the advancement of securitization as the only solution for managing mobility in the EU. So we would really like to also see an indicator that is assessing very closely how Frontex is doing with this increased role and budgets. So to conclude, maybe, just a second. These are some of the main things, maybe the takeaways from our exercise of mapping exit regimes. Just applying restrictive and harsh measures we discovered are very expensive. Evidently they harm migrants, but we could have not correlated with advancing the effectiveness or efficiency of current exit regimes, and again, according to their own stated goals of what they're supposed to achieve. Then politically, it looks like we are caught up in a securitization paradox, where if things work well in that sense of exiting people from member states or the European Union, then the logic is, oh, we need more investment. And if things don't work well, then again, the logic is, and the conclusion is, oh, it's because we need more investment. So basically, we're caught up in this securitization paradox, and we have seen very little evidence of things that we could establish that are not working in an effective or efficient way, but we haven't seen any signs of them being rolled back. So we think that this kind of securitization paradigm is very, very dominant. And that is why we think that it's recommended to actually do a paradigmatic shift towards protection and inclusion. So to advocate much more regularization procedures and make them less hidden and much more accessible for migrants, instead of just focusing the exit regimes on the removal of people from one place to another. And with it, we also call for maybe the final indicator, which is a normative indicator for evaluating the otherwise vague notion of what constitute proportional and necessary measures when you regulate and implement exit regimes. And we think, or we are even concerned, that without this kind of normative indicators, we risk that this kind of ever more inhumane treatment of irregular migrants is just becoming the norm and is being augmented by restrictive policies, because we all, I think, should, and I'm sure we are recognizing that we are living in a certain political climate when it comes to the management of mobility in Europe. So we really think that there is a place for this kind of normative indicators about the underpinning values and ideas of what is necessary and proportional in managing exit. Thank you very much for the attention. I will now give the floor to Talita to continue on post-exit sustainable integration. Please, Talita.
Thank you so much, Barak. I'll just share my screen. Is that showing fine? Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you, Barak. Thank you so much to the traffic team for this invitation to share our research findings. I will be presenting work on behalf of Katie Cushmander and myself. And within the work package on exit governance, we focused on task 2.4, which was looking at individual experiences of return and reintegration post-exit. We conducted a cross-country comparative study of return to 3 case countries, Albania, Iraqi Kurdistan, and Senegal, taking a qualitative in-depth approach. Our core research objectives were firstly to understand the return decision-making of migrants who do not have the legal right to stay in the EU, and particularly to understand their decision-making regarding whether or not to accept assisted voluntary return. Secondly, we wanted to better understand return migrants' experiences since their return, to understand whether migrants returned via AVR or forced removal are being sustainably reintegrated, and what are the impacts of EU policy on reintegration processes, and also comparing reintegration processes among migrants returned via AVR and forced removal. Just a brief note on concepts and terminology here. As I'm sure many in the audience already know, sustainable reintegration has become a key term in exit governance, but there is no commonly accepted definition of sustainable reintegration, and therefore no consensus on what precisely policies to support sustainable reintegration should be achieving, and then how we would actually measure and evaluate whether sustainable reintegration has been achieved or not. In this study, we don't adopt an existing definition of sustainable reintegration, and nor do we propose a new definition. But what we've really tried to do in the studies is focus on what the individual migrants interviewed told us about their reintegration experiences and what they emphasized as being important to them. And secondly, just to note that we refer to assisted voluntary return, or AVR, as a policy category, a type of policy and programming, and not as an indication of the actual voluntariness of the decisions to return when migrants are returned via AVR programs. The fieldwork was conducted in 2020 and 2021. Fortunately, I was able to conduct the fieldwork with Dr. Ilir Gereshi in Albania prior to the COVID-19 pandemic started. But the fieldwork in Iraq and in Senegal had to be subcontracted to local partners. So in Iraqi Kurdistan, this was conducted by Botan Shabarzeri, who had to do most of the interviews by telephone. And in Senegal, Professor Mamadou Dime led a team of field workers in Senegal who did manage to do most of the interviews in person. The type of return migrants we wanted to speak to in this research were those who were returned from any EU country, either via assisted voluntary return or forced removal. But we also included in that returns via voluntary humanitarian return from Libya, and also other returns from countries of transit. So where Senegalese migrants were trying to reach the EU, but they were returned from countries such as Libya, Morocco, Algeria. We wanted to speak primarily to those who had returned to their countries of origin in the last 10 years, but at least 12 months prior to interview, because we were interested in capturing these longer-term integration processes, which are not typically captured in monitoring and evaluation. A word on the research sample. So we ended up interviewing 120 return migrants, 50 in Albania, 40 in Iraqi Kurdistan, 30 in Senegal, most of whom had been returned via assisted voluntary return, although the proportions differ across the 3 case countries. The large majority returned between 2015 and 2019, but as you'll see in the graph on the top right, the years of return varied across the 3 case countries, also reflecting different patterns of migration and return migration in those countries. The gender composition across the 3 countries varies also. In Senegal, we only spoke to male return migrants. In Albania, it was much more balanced. This also, of course, reflects migration and return patterns in the 3 case countries. And in Senegal, 11 of the 30 return migrants interviewed had returned from a non-EU country of transit. So, for example, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, as I mentioned. And then in addition to this, we interviewed 26 key stakeholders, for example, government representatives, people working at NGOs, IGOs, broader civil society who were involved in supporting return and reintegration. So let me firstly overview our findings on return decision making. So firstly, it's important to note that where AVR or VHR, so voluntary humanitarian return, was accepted, this was generally because the migrant did not consider that they had any other option or no acceptable option, no acceptable alternative. So in most cases, AVR or VHR was considered better than staying in Libya or staying on irregularly in the EU with no chance of legalization, staying on in the asylum system in poor conditions and without hope, often after already having received 1 or 2 rejections on their cases, or being forcibly removed. And an interesting particularity of the Albanian case was that many of the return migrants interviewed in Albania accepted AVR because they were concerned to avoid a forced return, because if they were forcibly returned, they would be subject to an EU entry ban, which would prohibit them from legally re-entering the EU for typically 2 to 3 years, but up to 5 years. And this relates to the greater access that Albanian nationals have to the EU. So they have visa-free access to the EU, and increasingly they have labor migration opportunities, particularly in Germany, since they opened up the Western Balkan regulation in 2016. So unlike the participants in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Senegal, who have very limited access to labor migration opportunities in the EU, Albanian nationals do have opportunities for at least legal re-entry to the EU or legal labor migration in the EU. And therefore, they didn't want to lose out on future migration opportunities. They didn't want to be subject to an EU entry ban, which would prohibit their future migration opportunities. And so they chose to accept AVR. So as one participant explained, I didn't want to ruin the passports, because if you go by force, you then have a problem with your passports. It doesn't allow us to go abroad for 3 or 5 years. And then, consistent with the consensus in the broader literature, reintegration assistance was not observed to be a determinant of return decisions, although it was considered helpful in many cases. So it did further encourage those who were already inclined to return or decided to return. For example, in the case of Senegalese respondents who already knew that they wanted to return to Senegal eventually. And then the exceptions to this general pattern are those respondents who did seek out or accept AVR for family reasons, or because they had at least partially completed their migration objectives, or in response to changing conditions, which was sometimes the case in Iraqi Kurdistan. And then where forced removals happened instead, this was often due to the respondents' misunderstanding of the asylum or the return process. In a couple of cases, just their unwillingness to return, or because in the case of Senegalese respondents particularly, because they weren't offered AVR, so they had no alternative to forced removal. I'll now overview the findings on reintegration in each of the case countries. So starting with Albania, there was widespread dissatisfaction with the quality of life in Albania. Economic conditions were assessed as very poor both before and after migrating. 76% of respondents had no regular work upon their return, and that was very similar to the proportion of those without regular work before migrating. So unemployment and the lack of decent employment opportunities was reported as a primary challenge for reintegration. Lack of access to quality or affordable healthcare was also a common frustration. In terms of social reintegration, there didn't seem to be any stigma associated with return in the Albanian case, but social support was also discussed as being low. Feelings of insecurity were also very high. 32% of respondents felt unsafe in their homes, 39% felt unsafe in their communities, generally due to their perceptions of high levels of criminality and the lack of access to justice. But more broadly, a high number of respondents felt very vulnerable due to their economic precarity and the lack of any safety net available to them. As one respondent said, if we are sick only 1 month, we cannot work and the bank will take the house. Feelings of hopelessness were common. As one respondent said, the years are going by, the future of my kids is the most important. All over the world, people have to work, and if you work, then you'll see the fruits of your work. Here you work as much as you can, and still you cannot see anything good coming from it. So there was a common perception, which has been reported by others working in Albania, that there's high a strong sense of pessimism, the idea that there's no future in Albania. And this was also reflected in the high rates of remigration aspirations reported by the Albanian research participants. 8 respondents had already remigrated for asylum since returning, and 82% wanted to migrate again at the time of interview, but there at the time of interview, they were generally hoping for labor migration opportunities instead. In Senegal, economic challenges were also very common, but some respondents were doing well or better economically, and there was a greater sense of optimism regarding their future prospects. As one respondent said, "My wish is to stay here because most of the time what is there, so what is in Europe, is here. You can stay in Senegal and work and succeed in Senegal." Social reintegration was a little more mixed. Family and community receptions were mixed. They were sometimes supportive, but sometimes very hostile. As one respondent who had experienced a very hostile reception within his family explained, "You see, it was as if I was a stranger in my own home. They look at you badly and you're considered dirty. It was really too hard." Poor mental health also resulted from migration trauma, so traumatic experiences of the irregular journey to Europe, but also of forced overland removals from other countries in Africa. Fears for personal safety in Senegal were uncommon, and remigration aspirations were also more mixed. 27% of respondents wanted to remigrate, but 47% wanted to stay, and 27% were unsure. In Iraqi Kurdistan, the picture was more mixed again, and this likely reflects the more diverse pre-migration situations of the respondents interviewed, and also their more diverse reasons for migration. So there was a fairly even split between those doing well economically, those doing okay, and those doing badly. But the negative impacts of the economic crisis in Iraqi Kurdistan and the economic impacts of COVID-19 were felt very keenly. The role of family in reintegration was also observed to be key, and receptions were mixed. But where there was a more critical or hostile family reception to the migrants' return, this was for different reasons than it was in Senegal. So whereas in Senegal, it was because families or communities were disappointed or disapproving that the migrant had returned without making something of themselves, without having accumulated the wealth that was expected of them. In Iraq, it was more because the families criticized the migrant for making the decision to migrate in an irregular way and with high risks in the first place. Fears for personal safety were not common. So only 8% felt unsafe in their homes, and 23% felt unsafe in their community. But where there were fears for personal safety, these were very acute. And it was largely in cases where migrants returned to the same social or political problems that had motivated their migration in the first place. Some had managed to resolve these problems during the course of their migration or upon their return, but others faced the same problems. And this meant for a couple of respondents, they couldn't even settle down in one place because they were so scared of being identified. As one respondent said, "I have to keep changing my location, fearing that they might one day come and arrest me." There were also broader fears in Iraqi Kurdistan of the country's political and economic stability, and remigration aspirations were also mixed. 55% wanted to stay, 28% wanted to remigrate, and 18% were unsure. So to conclude on what we've learned about sustainable reintegration across these 3 case countries, there were no clear differences between the reintegration of respondents returned via AVR or forced removal, but it was clear that the shock of a sudden and unanticipated return does pose a significant barrier to reintegration. Overall, few respondents could be considered sustainably reintegrated, whether you look at it from a kind of more pragmatic definition or a more ambitious definition. It was not clear that AVR offers a path to sustainable reintegration. Where reintegration assistance was received, it was often considered very helpful, but it was also very limited. Forced removal does, however, create some added costs or difficulties for return migrants. So the Albanian migrants who were forcibly returned had their savings confiscated from them often. They were subject to an entry ban, which prevented them from seeing families in other EU countries, or taking up labor migration opportunities in the EU. They are less able to prepare for their return, of course, in the case of forced removal, and in the case of forced overland removals from countries of transit, the Senegalese respondents were returned from these overland forced removals were often very dangerous journeys. And it's also worth noting that even those migrants who returned via AVR or VHR sometimes conceived of their return as deportation. So as one Senegalese respondent who was returned from Libya said, "I was forced to go back, but I didn't want to come back. My return is explained by the fact that I was detained in prison and the IOM came to offer us safe passage to get us out of that misery. That is how they forced us to come back." And the degree of true voluntariness is highlighted by stakeholders as important for reintegration. So as one, I think, NGO representative in Senegal explained, those who returned of their own free will find it easier to reintegrate because they have an idea in mind. Otherwise, they would have preferred to stay there tired and suffering until they died. That's how the migrant works. That's why I find that those who return voluntarily have 1,000 chances to integrate quickly, but the one who has been forced, he has been surprised, he is overwhelmed by the situation. Secondly, it's clear that economic challenges are very common, most commonly reported in this study, but reintegration is challenged by multiple and interacting factors. So for example, in Albania, it was a lack of access to healthcare that often inhibited reintegration into the labor market. For example, in the case of a respondent who had an amputated leg and who had not managed to access a decent prosthesis in either Albania or Germany, where he sought asylum. In Iraqi Kurdistan, a couple of respondents returned to the same social or political problems which threatened their safety and forced them to hide and move around, as mentioned. And in Senegal, a key stakeholder observed that unsupported family receptions can inhibit economic reintegration, both by affecting the return migrants' psychosocial health and also by undermining the effective use of reintegration assistance, because as this key stakeholder observed, families sometimes pressured the return migrant to, for example, sell their reintegration assistance in order to repay debts or contribute to the family's living expenses, rather than invest that in building a sustainable livelihood. Third, it is also clear that often it's the same factors that motivated migration in the first place that challenge reintegration upon return. So whether that was a lack of access to healthcare, social security provisions, employment, or financial services, or due to political instability or social or political problems. So it's clear that these structural problems that motivate migration also pose significant barriers to reintegration upon return. Relatedly, migrants who are better integrated before migrating are also better to reintegrate upon their return. So for example, if they had stable or formal employment before migrating, they were often able to take these jobs back up upon their return. In contrast, those who were very poorly integrated prior to migrating were also poorly reintegrated upon their return, which begs the question to what extent we can expect people who are very poorly integrated prior to migrating to be able to sustainably reintegrate upon their return without significant structural changes. And finally, reintegration was observed to be a highly individual and a very fragile process in which sustainability is not quickly achieved. So the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on disrupting reintegration processes was clear. One Iraqi respondent commented that our situation was economically better, but because of COVID-19, it slowly got worse. That is because I work as a taxi driver now. If it were not for COVID-19, I couldn't earn an amount that can cover my daily needs. So there, they were doing okay, and they were set back by the economic impact of the pandemic. And then also just broader bad luck. And that's particularly the case where reintegration is focused on business startup, which is of course always a risky venture. So as one Senegalese respondent explained, that they had difficulties with the sheep that they were given as their reintegration assistance. The sheep died, only 5 of them are left. things didn't go as expected. So to finally reflect on some key policy recommendations coming out of this study, we recommend that we shouldn't be calling it assisted voluntary return. We should be calling it assisted return, as some countries already do, in order to acknowledge the lack of voluntariness in many cases, and also to shift the emphasis on supporting preparedness for return. The Albanian case study also highlights that access to legal labor migration or legal re-entry to the EU can act as an incentive for complying with return orders. So this suggests that the creation of accessible pathways for legal labor migration would encourage compliance with return orders. A multidimensional and adaptable approach to reintegration programming is required. So it shouldn't just be focused on economic reintegration, and it shouldn't just be a one-time interaction or one-time moment of support. Programming needs to monitor and accompany the return migrant and to respond to setbacks and changing conditions. The structural problems that frustrate reintegration and which motivated migration in the first place often have to be acknowledged. So return and reintegration needs to be considered within and aligned with broader development policy frameworks and interventions. Sustainable reintegration must be understood as a long-term process. So unlike it shouldn't be assessed after 12 months as it commonly is in monitoring and evaluation, but we recommend that sustainable reintegration should not be assessed until a period of at least 2 years after return. And it also must be measured from the return migrants' own perspectives, because it's their subjective perceptions of their conditions and the ability and the degree to which they're able to fulfill their own individual aspirations that shapes their satisfaction with their own lives and also their migration decision-making. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to any comments or questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Talita. I give the floor to Zeynep for some commentary, and then I still encourage everyone to just drop questions already in the Q&A if you have them, and we will pick them up after. Please, Zeynep.
Yeah, thank you, Barak. I want to start with thanking to Anya for her, the invitation. I remember that in the 2019 IMISCO, we had a chat with Anya, and you were just starting to the EDMIGO project, and it's good to see that you are very close to the finishing it. I know how it's challenging with the Horizon Europe projects in terms of, the multi-partnerships and the depth of the reports. Let me, very quickly start up with some of, the comments, and also my comments will have some questions on them. I had a chance to read some of the reports from this work package, and also the final report of the work package on exits. And let me just say in the very beginning that it seems to me that these reports in general and the final report in particular is really good in addressing the policy gaps and also some scholarship challenges about return. And my first observation in general in this work package and deliverables, that you did a really good job in broadly conceptualizing the exits and exit regimes. And also, to analytically discuss it through this legal and operational infrastructure. And it seems to me that exit is more a neutral term or less loaded term compared to return or readmission or removal or expulsion, all these, the sets of concepts we are using in both in policy realm and also in academia. Besides this, the conceptual clarity in the reports in general, I really, encourage to, the listeners to look at these reports, at least for these conceptual clarities in the very beginning of each report. And I also, to acknowledge that there is this, you tackle with this measurement challenge in the exit regimes, and looking at these 3 parameters specifically to evaluate the divergent practices in the exit regimes. And my understanding that these 3 parameters you are looking at is these length and conditions of the pre-removal detention. The second one is the investments in these operations aimed at implementing exit policies in the EU. And the third one is this estimated success rate of the existing exit models. And it seems that, this is a good mental exercise to create a return governance indicators. And as many of you, and we know that there is this long-term effort to create some indicators for governance and the return. And right now there is this, IOM and also the AMN efforts for good indicators, but we see that the return is kind of missing there. I think your work will fit there to to create these return part of, or in your terms, exit indicators, exit regime indicators. I think my question here is I have 2 questions about these measurements part or these parameters. The first one is that to what extent we can transfer these parameters to understand the exit regimes beyond EU in the non-EU countries. And it comes to my mind, I know for a long time, I'm also working on the south-to-south migration and the south-to-south returns. And I'm wondering, to what extent we can transfer them to there to understand. The first sets of countries comes to my mind, those who are in the very close periphery of the EU, like transit countries like in Turkey or Tunisia or Morocco. And to what extent we can use these parameters, because also I see that there is this policy shift in these countries to return, kind of a chain returning of those, the EU is returning to them, and then this country is trying to returning to others. And there is this attempts for bilateral return agreements, such as between Turkey and Afghanistan, or Turkey and Bangladesh, or Tunisia and Mali, that type of, the chain, I call this a chain return regimes. And also in other cases, I know that, for instance, in South Africa, also it is not in the EU periphery, but we have some, the deportation and exit regime is developing in South Africa and in India. And to what extent these parameters can be transferable? This is the first one. The first question is about these parameters. The second question about the parameters, actually, you in the very end, you brought it, is that this normative indicator, right? Also, you have another, the work package just about protection and the human rights, and I see this holistic approach. But I am wondering to what extent we can put this normative indicator within these parameters in the beginning. But I see there is this challenge of measuring how we are going to measure this, this indicator. Measuring others is a little easier. Let's say you can look at the return rates or the detention duration. But I'm wondering, is there any space to put there is the one thing. And from there, this parameter issue, I want to, to move to your findings and the recommendations. I also, in the very final report, I really like that how you relate the findings and the recommendations together. I think this is also something we really, I was looking for at least, and it's impossible to disagree any of your recommendations or in any of your, findings. And I want to start with, you have 3 main in this project. I want to start with the one, and I have a couple of questions about each. Or not each, together about these 3 evidences. The first one, you are, the reports is generally talking about this, how this evidence policy making can be taken more seriously by collecting and sharing the statistics, and specifically about the length of the pre-removal detention and the possible alternatives. And you very clearly say that there is no causal link between increasing the pre-detention duration and the return rates. It's very clear, and but despite that, I think that the EC, European Commission, knows this already. I mean, but there is this recommendation to do longering the periods. Although practitioners, as Barak underlined, although practitioners say that okay, in 2 or 3 months, it's clear that whether people can be sent back or not. But right now, this detention period is up to 18 months, up to the 20. But I kind of a little, wondering, can we dig a little more to that part? The logic behind this long detention, does this pre-removal detention itself has a symbolic value in a way that, or indirect, expected indirect impact? What I mean the 2 things. First, these detentions, possible deterrence effects for those who are who wants to irregularly arrive to Europe, to give this audience the message that if you arrive, there is this the detention potentiality, and look at the examples. Can be one the indirect expected impact like that. Just I am the suspecting. The second one is to giving a message to the public audience in the EU, to say that the governments are putting in a control and order over these removal issues, over this irregular migration in general, and saying that okay, there are these mechanisms. Or am I maybe very the conspiracy theorists, and this is just this is a governance failure? I mean, there is this governance failure, or the policy failure in which they are not deportable and there is nothing to do, and they are lengthening to the pre-detention the period. This is, I think, and here I want to also to ask that I didn't see in your reports that do you have any chance to interview policymakers or experts working in the EU and to look at their internal narratives or their sense making or their framing of these issues, not the NGOs, but those who are in the really policy making stages. This is one, the thing I want to, to underline. The another one, which I really found very interesting, and I also see that you have a separate report about these regularization frameworks and alternatives to detention, alternatives to, the return. And you very, the fairly underline that, that, okay, there are some tools for regularization, but these are very, very limited, like persons requiring a medical treatment or maintaining a family unity. There are only such very, very extreme cases are under this scheme. Not those about employment or residence or cultural integration. But during the COVID time, we see some, the kind of a hope about these regularizations coming from some countries like, Portugal or Spain. I am wondering, are they such a kind of, the one-time event? I mean, it's just very short time, or do you trace any policy diffusion or any best practices copying during the COVID time in this regard, in this regularization? Also, the COVID very clearly showed that, okay, EU and our other countries also needed such, these essential workers, and they are filled by, the migrants or asylum seekers. And I'm asking, is there any type of, let's say, an opening or continuation of these windows of opening after COVID? And the second, the main finding, it is very, clearly underlined in this investment in Frontex and the necessity of the monitoring and accountability. I remember that in our project, the Horizon 1 in Europe, we also have a separate report about Frontex, accountability and monitoring. I have other similar projects have also, the reports about it, but and I like your recommendation that there should be a clearer guideline regarding the presence of monitorings, and specifically you are saying, okay, at least cultural interpreters or cultural mediators should be in each flight deporting, the people. I like this part, but I have a little, the couple of questions about this. we also underline this consultative forum, which is already here since 2012, right? And it is also made up by IOM, by UNHCR, even Save the Children, and they have all these guidelines about, you know, the voluntary return, child sensitivity, woman gender sensitivity, this and that. And I am wondering to what extent these, you know, these who have a huge experience on these issues and standards, do they have a real impact on the Frontex? Were you able to trace some, you know, the direct impact of them through this consultative forum? This is one, you know, the question. Also, in your presentation, also in the reports, you are telling about these border control technology markets and I mean these private sectors. And I'm wondering to what extent, you know, these private sector played a role in the expansion of the Frontex mandate. And it is, you know, because since, you know, also in the last pact, we see that, you know, the Frontex is getting more and more power in terms of its authority, mandate, and investment. Even the schemes like ERIN, it was dissolved, and such things as even return counseling is going right now is in the direction of the Frontex. And this is something, you know, the needs is important. And from there, I want to just, you know, move to the sustainable reintegration topic. Actually, in the project right now I am leading here, we are also looking at these reintegration trajectories, and I'm implicitly comparing our findings. Actually, I mean, there are many similarities, and nothing to, you know, disagree with your findings. But I have a couple, and this is very clear. Your message is very clear that effectiveness of the returns is conditional upon sustainable reintegration, but sustainable reintegration is also conditional upon the return preparedness and the voluntariness and a real sense of voluntariness, let's say, and the flexibility of these policies and the programs in relation to the context, which is in a national context or family context, also needs of the returnees. And the messages is very valuable and important. We also, you know, dealing with this term reintegration. I am wondering how is your experience with this concept as a reintegration concept? We know that it's a policy concept. How did returnees or local stakeholders reflect in this concept? For instance, in our case, we found that they don't really like this term reintegration. Even we didn't use this very directly, but how is this experience? To what extent these, you know, this concept is working? And also, you mentioned in the report that this reintegrate the components of the reintegration is expanding in IOM definition and also in the definition of the, you know, this UN migration network, and even dignity right now is in the inside of these reintegration components, right? And but these are also the very subjective things like dignity, well-being, and how we are going to, you know, to measure. And can you please a little reflect on these, you know, this dignity and expansion of the reintegration definition? And another point about this is last point about reintegration is that in Europe, in our case, we at least in Germany, we are right now is observing that the national bodies who are dealing with the return and the reintegration trying to get the support of the diaspora organizations for return programs or for reintegration programs. And I see also the IOM's effort in this regard. Did you notice something similar in other country contexts? The bringing or taking to the, you know, the diaspora organizations or immigrant organizations in this business of return and the reintegration. My last comment will be about, you know, the general comments for all of you, and also a kind of a question. As I said in the beginning, I like this, you know, this exit term conceptualization, exit regime conceptualization, but at the same time, I know that this is not the term which the EU is a lot of time using. I mean, it's using it, is not, but return, for instance, is used more. Or for instance, is in the scholarly debates also, this term doesn't have, I mean, it's more like, you know, the return or deportation or repatriation, such terms is, you know, the use. I am wondering how you are communicating with the policy world and also, you know, the scholarly work by using this exit as an umbrella term, which is not that much in the circulation. This is one question. Maybe it's a very naive question, but I really, you know, really wonder it. And the other one is that actually in one part in your paper you mention, and also you in there you bring it again and again, this stakeholder, and also not sharing of the data with you, although you are, you know, working on, and you are, you know, we are funded by the EU. And to what extent the scholars are approached as a stakeholders engaged in migration processes, and what we can do more to be accepted as a stakeholders in this huge migration debate. I think this is my question, and I will stop here. And thank you for inviting me. And I hope I didn't go very extremes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zainab. These are lovely comments, and I'm not sure that we will do justice to all of them in the 12 minutes that we have, but thank you so much for the input, which for sure we will work more with. I also welcome Katie, that I see that she's with us, maybe answering some of the questions. I'll take the liberty to answer first to some of the things you raised, Zainab, and then I will pass it over to Talita and Katie. Let me start with the term exit. And you're absolutely right that return is the term that is used more. And we did try to restrict ourselves mostly to the terminology of the EU, recognizing that this is a EU-funded project and that we speak back to EU policymakers. But I think that we also felt a bit more comfortable ourselves with coining this notion of an exit regime in order to say that there are more things that are at play here than just this notion of returning people. And by that, maybe taking the discussion into this kind of a more holistic, broader level, which we believe it should be engaged at. Can the parameters that we indicate be transferable or implemented in other countries, like in transit, so-called transit countries? I think that probably yes, but I don't see them implemented yet in member states in the European Union. So in order to sort of have something as a transferable knowledge or a know-how to assess exit regimes, we first have to see that we have managed to implement them somewhere. And basically what our reports are showing is that this is not the case at the moment. So I would be skeptical about starting to import them or imposing them even on other countries before we have seen them at work in some member states, if not the entire European Union. The symbolic value of pre-removal detention, I think you're absolutely right. It is definitely aimed with this notion of deterrence in mind, I think. But as we could find and correlate statistics that are available, it doesn't seem to be effective, which then leads to the second thing that you pointed, which is sort of a token to certain publics. And I think that, yeah, that is basically what it is. So when the European Union or member states have to speak back to publics in that terms of being strong and tough on migration, then one of the things that they go-to thing is pre-removal detention. And I mean, I don't know to what extent this can still be expanded, but I think by now it must be also for some of the policymakers something that sort of becomes, even on that level of just a tokenism, it becomes counterproductive. I mean, would they put it next time to 30 months? You know, I mean, this is like, and we have to keep in mind that we're talking about administrative detention, right? This is not, these are people that didn't commit any crime. And in many of European member states, even families with kids are being detained for just awaiting deportation. So the whole thing is very shakeable, I think, normatively. And to be honest, if I should put the finger on what I think is really at play here, is then we also have to bring in this notion of an exit industry that I think a lot of people write very well and critically in the context of the US, but much less I think is spoken about it in the European context. So all this machinery and infrastructure, both the legal and the operational one, is of course fitting into a lot of sectors that are driving profit out of it. And even government are, of course, can expand their budgets, and Frontex can expand its budget, when that idea of like pre-removal detention can just be prolonged forever. So I would like to see actually more critical discussion around that in Europe. Very quickly, COVID, can it really lead to more regularization? Again, excuse my skepticism in the field, but I would think that this is much more of an ad hoc and again, self-serving measures that in the time of pandemic just were very useful for some local labor markets. And unless we see a more structural move to real new or reinforced pathways for regularization, I would still treat these things that happen under COVID as flimsy and ad hoc. Then the expansion of Frontex. Again, I agree with everything you said. The consultative forum, from what we gather, had very little actual impact. It doesn't have, in a way, any fit. It cannot really bite back to Frontex, which also led a lot of members from civil society in the consultative forum to resign, to not be willing to just serve as this kind of a whitewashing platform for some of the actions of Frontex. And yeah, one maybe last point that I want to make about the expansion of Frontex and about pre-removal detention that has to do with this normative indicator. I think what we aim there is that we just want to put again on the table and reinforce discussion about this kind of underpinning values and norms that are behind these measures. Otherwise, we, at least in the work package, have this notion that much of it is done in a populist way or in that kind of modeling through. So there are like a set of measures, and the only thing that we see is that they are being made more and more restrictive. It's not as if there is really an open engagement with rethinking things that are not working well, with coming up with more innovative and less restrictive measures. But it's just like, okay, there is already the pre-removal detention, so things doesn't work well. Well, just let's just put 3 more months into it. And without also this kind of indicators of gathering with a clear methodology knowledge about how to assess these measures, I think there is pretty much this kind of shooting in the dark strategy at the moment. It's like we don't even know if these kind of more restrictive measures work. And from what we can gather, usually we see that they don't work. So I really think that it's very much influenced by the political climate at which we are, which is very much anti-immigration, anti-refugee. And there is very little scientifically evidence-based kind of thinking in a methodical and creative way for solutions. So, like I said, I could not really engage all the interesting points that you raised, Annie, but I've noted them down, and it will be wonderful to work with them. I will give now the floor to Talitha and Katie, maybe to address some of the other points.
Katie, would you like to start off?
Sure, thank you. Thank you all, and thanks, Zainab, very much for the comments. And it's great to see you again and great to discuss and have your perspectives on the project. And I'm not sure how much you know, but the projects are very similar to what you guys are doing. And we had discussed with your predecessors a few years ago when we started about how to create some congruencies between the projects because they are so similar in approach. But I think you raised, I'm picking up on 2 points that you raised that I think are really important. I think one is this concept of reintegration. And the second one that I'll come to then is the role of sort of the diaspora in return. And I from those conversations with your predecessors, I know that you asked people what they think about the term reintegration and what were their thoughts on it. And I really look forward to seeing your results on that. I think it's super interesting. But we didn't ask anything like that. So we don't really explore at all how people see the term or how they feel about the term. We focused more just on their experiences overall and asking that in a variety of ways, generally not saying, of course, what's your experience of reintegration, but asking how they experience the process of coming back. So when we look at the definition, we did question it a bit because it does feel like these definitions are changing every year as to what is sustainable reintegration and which one do you go with and how is it applied. And I think I can just say my own take on it, and using in this report the one from the UN Network on Returns, is that I think that what they've come out with is really trying to be an agenda setting definition that is a key part of advocacy, and it's aspirational. And I think it really tries to incorporate what all of the different UN agencies see. And I think a large part is that also from the Office of Human Rights and from UNICEF and from UNHCR, not just from the IOM perspective, but from this larger perspective of what should be happening in a return process and what should sustainable reintegration be. Because clearly when we look at the current environment and policy environment, it's not achievable, right? I mean, from everything we know, we've done research on, you can't achieve what they're saying in that definition, and you can't even really measure it at this moment. We would not be able to measure it from the work that we did. So I think it's really important to have it there and to keep it and use it as an aspiration at this moment, but that then we're reflecting on how could we actually get there and see if policymakers and member states and the EU start picking it up and saying we want to achieve this or not, and then mapping out how do we get there is, I think, a key part of it. And I think then the part of diaspora is also quite interesting. So I'm not sure when they started this, and I'm not sure that I'm 100% correct on it, but it's my understanding, I think, that the Netherlands started this over a decade ago. They started with what they called native counselors with IOM, and native counselors were sent into local communities, trying to really go into communities where there was irregular migrants and to speak with them to more or less conduct return counseling, or in other terms, to convince people to return. And they found, there's a study conducted by Arjen Lerks and colleagues, where they found that countries where there were in AVR programs with a native counselor were significantly more likely to have a higher number of returns than programs without a native counselor. And so this information has definitely spread, and I believe it has been a factor influencing other countries to also invest more into using native counselors or diaspora to discuss with people to encourage them to return. I think that I mean, there are definitely cases where we've discussed and had blatant discussions in the Netherlands, I think, with IOM and colleagues about, well, what about the ethics of this and how does this work? And I mean, they've always said, well, there's no coercion involved, and it also depends a lot on the country and the individual. And in some cases, return can be more beneficial for people than staying in the Netherlands irregularly. And it's important that they learn about these options. And they're not forced, of course, to take AVR. It's still presented as an option, but they're giving the information in a way that people can accept. So, of course, there's, I mean, different arguments that can be made on different sides of this. But in any case, it's my understanding this is sort of where it originated from and how it's grown. But it is very active in the Netherlands if you wanted to learn more about it. And we have quite a few connections with IOM here with the staff. If you want to interview any of them, we're happy to share contact information. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Talita, there is a question from Benjamin in the Q&A. Do you want to maybe answer that one? It's about whether how justified it is to frame returnees as individuals, or to put it in a different way, to what extent the embeddedness in network is actually a key element in their decision-making processes.
Thanks, Bert. Yeah, I know we're running out of time, so I'll make it as brief as possible. And I think Katie also commented on this question. I I think we need to understand migration decision-making, return decision-making, reintegration experiences in the context of social relationships, influences, social norms. I think Jessica Hagen-Zanker and colleague recently published a kind of literature review on these more intangible and subjective facets of migration decision-making. And I think return decision-making is very much underrepresented in this emerging area. But I do think that, as much as I'm really interested in, yes, these social influences, social norms, the degree to which migrants adopt or can choose between different cultural repertoires and how that affects their life aspirations, migration decision-making, reintegration experiences, I think it's really important. But I would also be concerned that if we don't frame returnees as individuals, we also undermine their agency and the degree to which, individual characteristics, personalities, aspirations, the degree to which people are sort of influenced by social expectations and relationships, etc. I don't think we can forget that. And then briefly on Nicoletta's question on psychosocial support, and thank you also, Nicoletta, for your comments on the study. I think psychosocial report is emphasized a lot in the context of Senegal as well as in other countries. I think in terms of the advocacy agenda, maybe what could help us, what we've already recommended is a shift to assisted return rather than assisted voluntary return, and an emphasis on supporting return preparedness, which also has to mean psychological preparedness. And I also think that maybe what could help the advocacy agenda is, if returnees return and their psychosocial health is very poor, and that would, I imagine, that perpetuate a migration culture in which young people particularly think that the only way of achieving their aspirations, of making something of themselves, would be to migrate, often irregularly. And if we can support psychosocial health, which would also support people to conceive of a future for themselves in their country of origin, or conceive of a future in which they can work towards regular opportunities for migration, then I think that is one sort of way to argue for the importance of psychosocial support, also in terms of, from the policymakers' perspective, of reducing irregular migration or remigration.
Thanks, Talita. I'm not sure how much we can diverge beyond the 1.5 hour, which we already exhausted. I want to then just very quickly answer the first question in the Q&A from Basema about whether the definition of exit also applies to refugees and migrants, asylum seekers whose application has been rejected but cannot be deported. It definitely is. And we do make a very big case about the need to move to structural ways to legalize the status of stateless people, for example, but also of so-called non-deportable migrants. And therein, we also call to really expand this kind of definition of what makes a person be defined as a non-deportable migrant. At the moment, some of these people have to go through 2-3 years of intense attempt to deport them before they are being recognized as not deportable. And we think that the definition of non-deportness or non-deportability should be rethought. So that was very quickly that. And then I think there are some people who raised their hands. So if we have the time, I would be very happy to let them in. I think Michael Debene has raised his hand. If you want to jump in.
I think we're waiting for him to post his message in the Q&A.
Right. Okay, but then I'm afraid that we are already 5 minutes after the time, so we probably should just call it a day. You can, of course, get in touch with us via email or just read our reports from the AdmiGov website, and we continue the conversation for sure in other fora. I want to thank mostly Zainik for a lovely commentary. It was really great to have you. I want to thank Katie and Talita and Anya and the Traffic Project for all the assistance with putting together this webinar, and everyone who took place and took part. Thank you very much.